Hi and welcome back. In our last video we began our introduction to CSS and discussing what CSS is and how you actually create styles to format HTML. We're going to continue that topic in this video. And the first thing that we need to talk about really is the location that you place your styles in. Now, up to this point, we've created all of our styles in a separate style sheet. But there are actually three different locations that you can define a CSS style in. You can define them externally, as we've been doing, in a separate CSS style sheet. You can define them internally, in the actual HTML page itself, by creating a section inside of the head section. For example, if I was to go ahead here and in the head section open the style tag up, and I'm going to go ahead and close that as soon as I open it, I could then define a one or more CSS styles right here in the head section. So for example, I could define a style for my H1s. I could do H1 curly bracket, and I could say that the font size is going to be just 12 pixels. We'd never make an H1 12 pixels, but you see what we're doing there. Exact same way we formatted the style inside of the style sheet here. The only difference is the location, and that actually affects quite a bit. But I could go ahead and define other styles if I wanted to as well. I could do H2 color is going to be, I'm going to make it red. So I'm going to do FF0000. That's red. And let's go ahead and take a look here, and you can see my H1s are now 12 pixels. And you can also see that my H2s here are red, or my H2 here is red. So a couple different places that you can define CSS styles in. I'm going to go ahead and delete those two styles. We'll come back to that. And the final way, or the final position that you can format a style in, is actually inline. Now, before, we had actually applied some class styles here for H2 and LI, and if we come down here a little bit more, we did the same thing down here in this P tag. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Adding a class style or class attribute is not the same as creating an inline style. Creating an inline style, you use the style attribute, not the class attribute, but the style attribute, actually in line with the element that you wish to style. And to do that, you simply here say style equals quote, and then you put the attribute that you want in here. For instance, if I want to make this red, I would go ahead and put the code for red in there. And you can see here the format is different. This is in the format of an attribute, not actually in the format that we're used to seeing a CSS style in. Mainly because there is no selector in this inline style. All there is a style declaration. And that's because the only place that this style affects anything is this element that it's defined in. It can't be reused. It can't affect anything else. That's the only place that it's going to affect anything at all. And when I go into design view here you can see that is now in red. So you can create inline styles, you can create internal styles, and you can create external styles. Now, there are very specific occasions where it may be advantageous to create an inline style. Those occasions are very rare. And there's basically only one or two occasions when it's at all proper to do. So generally speaking, you're always going to stay away from creating inline styles. Stay away from inline styles altogether. Internal styles, again, there really is no use for them. So again, you're going to stay away from internal styles as well. All the styles that we're going to work with and that you should be using in your designs are going to be kept in external style sheets. And this is going to affect how useful your CSS is, as well as how flexible it is for you. And then it's also going to affect something called inheritance and precedence. Let me give you an example of that. I'm going to go ahead and delete all those styles from my CSS style sheet. And now you can see that my HTML file is back to normal. Let's say I define an H1 style in my external style sheet. And I simply say that the color of my H1s should be red. And in this case, red, that's the color code for it. And again, you can remember that your colors, when they're called out this way, are basically 3 pairs of digits. The R value, the G value, and the B value. The red, green, and blue value. 0 means completely turned off. F means completely turned up or completely turned on. So you can read what this definition is. This is turning the red all the way up and turning the green and the blue all the way off. And some colors are very easy to identify, other colors are very difficult to identify. And again, you're going to see some of these colors, and by the end of this video course, you'll have some basic colors memorized. But there's always that pick attribute that you can use inside of Expression Web to select your color. So I went ahead and defined the color of my H1s. And whoops, why isn't that taking effect? Let's go ahead and look in Code View here. We are linking to our style sheet. Oh, I have a space in there. There we go. And now when we look at this, there we go. Our headings are now in red. But what happens if I have a conflict? If I have an H1 color definition or style definition here externally, and then also I create another style definition internally for H1. Let's say I do H1 here and say that the style for my H1 should be green, which would be 00FF00. So now I have a style internally and a style externally, and they conflict. One says it should be red and the other says it should be green. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this in Design View, and you can see they're showing up as green. And this has to do with what's called style precedence. Style precedence. The closer a style definition is to the element that it's formatting, the more precedence it has. So an inline style, since it's right there with the element, will take precedence or override an internal style. And an internal style, since it's in the document itself, will take precedence or override an external style. And to see that, let's go ahead and I'm going to come in here to the code. And here's my H1. And I'm going to go ahead and define an inline style. And this time it's going to be the color value is going to be blue. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. And then when I go in here, you'll see my heading is now blue. So this inline style is taking precedence over the internal style and the external style because it is closer to the element that it's formatting. Now, just because one style is overriding another style for a particular property does not mean that the other properties of the style would be ignored. For example, right now I've got 3 different H1s defined, styles for H1s defined. But let's say I came out here and I added a property to my external style sheet. And let's say that that was going to be for font size. And I want to make the font size 12 pixels, something really small. I'll save that and come back in here to design view, and you can see that my main headings are now 12 pixels in height. The color is still being applied from the inline style or the internal style. But since the internal style right up here and the inline style don't say anything about the font size, the item is inheriting that from this element or from this style. But if I was to define the font size, let's say up here, and let's say I say the font size here is going to be 18 pixels. Now that is going to override the external style. So you can see the way the precedence takes place. Now, the first and most obvious reason why you're not going to want to mix all of these up is that this very quickly will become very unmanageable for you. You won't have any idea whether an element is being styled by an inline style or by an internal style or the external style. You won't have any idea what rule is actually affecting that element. So for consistency's sake, you're going to want to use only external styles. The other benefits of using external style sheets are this. One, if I use internal styles, I have to define those internal styles in every single HTML page. So if I had, let's say I have an about page and a contact page, and I want to format my H1s in this way, well, I would have to go and recreate that style definition in every single page. And if I ever wanted to change that attribute, let's say I wanted to change the color, I'd have to go to every single page and I'd have to find that, or I'd have to change that in the head section. Whereas an external style sheet, since it's linked to multiple pages, it can be attached to as many different HTML pages as you want. You have one definition here and you make that one change and it automatically affects all the pages that that style sheet is attached to. So that's going to really give you a lot more flexibility. It's going to speed up changing things and testing things. And it's also going to lead to more consistency. Because if you're doing internal styles or inline styles, it's real easy to change value inadvertently or to leave a value off. And then all of a sudden one of your pages looks different than all the rest of your pages. So there are a lot of benefits to using external style sheets as opposed to internal styles or inline styles. And again, taking that sort of one step further, if you were to create only inline styles. Here, not only would you have to go to every page and make the change individually, like you would, let's say, in a word processing document, you'd have to find every occurrence of that style or that element and make that change individually. So really, internal styles and inline styles really do limit the flexibility and the usefulness of style sheets. So for that reason, again, with just one or two exceptions, we're going to completely stay away from inline styles or internal styles. We're going to only use external style sheets in our project. Now, going along the same sort of topic of inheriting styles and determining how things are formatted, I've gone ahead and removed all of my styles from here, so we're back to just a plain sheet. I'm going to go ahead and delete that style from my external style sheet, and again, we're back to normal here. What determines the way this looks right here? We know this is an H1 right here. But where is it defined that if something is an H1, it should be in Times New Roman, bold, and 24 pixels? What says that an H2 should be 18 pixels bold and Times New Roman and black? And the answer is, it's the browser's style sheet that determines that. If there is no style definition for a particular element, it's whatever the browser default is that formats that particular element. And that actually presents a huge problem in designing web pages, because Internet Explorer has slightly different defaults than Firefox does, and that does Chrome and Safari. So different browsers have different defaults. So the answer to that is you need some way to make all of the browser defaults exactly the same. You need all of the elements to be formatted on your page the same, whether it's in Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, or Safari. And fortunately, it's a big problem, but there is a very simple answer. And that's by using what's called a CSS reset. A CSS reset. And what a CSS reset does is it zeroes out or makes uniform all of the different defaults for all of your different elements on your page. You can think of a CSS reset sort of like the primer coat that you put on before you actually paint something. You know, you always put primer on before you paint a room or a car, or even before you start painting on a canvas, to make sure that the surface that you're painting on is uniform and that there's no variation from one place to another. CSS Reset does the exact same thing, but with browsers. Now, there are lots and lots of CSS resets that have been written that you can use. They generally fall into three categories. Something that's called a hard reset. Another kind of a CSS reset is called a simple reset. And a third kind of a reset is called a full reset. Now, again, you can go on the internet and search for CSS reset, and you can find lots of different resources for that. Everybody's got sort of their own or uses their own CSS reset, whether it was developed by somebody else or whether they developed it on their own. There actually is a very popular CSS reset by a guy named Eric Meyer, and if you search for Eric Meyer CSS reset, you'll see lots of articles about CSS reset. Just simply Google that, Eric Meyer CSS reset. and you'll get all the information you ever wanted to know about resets. And his is a full reset. And I also have one that comes with my framework that I like using that you're going to see in a moment. And it again is a full reset. But what some people do is they do what's called a hard reset. And the way a hard reset works is they put an asterisk, which is a wildcard character, which means match everything. And then they put several style definitions in here. They go ahead and do font family and select a font. They do font size and select a base font size. They do color and usually define everything as black. And then they do margin 0, padding 0, and border 0. So what this does, and we haven't discussed the box model properties yet, but we will. This makes all the text and all of the boxes around the items uniform. And they might also do like font weight here. Normal. Font style. Normal. The more things you put into this hard reset, the more it sort of becomes like a simple reset. But now when we look at our test sheet here, and actually it's not showing up here, but if I look at this in a browser, you're going to see the way this appears. And I'm really glad this happened, because one thing that you need to really understand about Expression Web or any other design program like Adobe Dreamweaver is that you cannot necessarily trust what you see in Design View. What you see in Design View here is not what's going to show up in a browser. If I was to go ahead and close this test sheet and reopen it, it might reset it. But in this case it didn't. So always check the way things are going to look in a browser. So you can see here, again, from looking at this in a browser, how I've now made all of the elements uniform on my page. All my fonts are the same, all my colors are the same, the spacing is the same, everything is uniform on the page. And again, that's all that a CSS reset is going to do. And that way, when you start specifying sizes and spacings and things like that, you're not going to have any interference from the actual browser. Now, very few designers use this kind of a hard reset. It's not very precise and it's not very complete and really doesn't serve the full purpose of a CSS reset. And since there are lots of CSS resets out there that you can use, it's best to use a full reset unless you're doing a very simple project. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that from here, and let's go ahead and take a look at an example of a full reset. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this here, and I'm going to go ahead and close this window, and I'm going to come back in here to my framework, and I'm going to go into my main framework folder, and I'm going to go into CSS, and I'm going to go ahead and open up basic.css. I'm going to do that by right clicking on it and saying edit with Microsoft Expression Web. And there's that CSS style sheet here, and you can see the very first section. By the way, this is the way a comment is formatted in CSS. There's a slash and an asterisk, the comment, and then a closing asterisk and slash to end the comment. But this is an example of a full CSS reset. And you can see it does a lot more and is a lot more specific than our hard reset. And what you can do is you can copy this and simply paste it into your style sheet. And again, there are lots of resets that are out there. Mine is one. It also adds a little bit of support for HTML5 elements as well. But it's this kind of a reset that you should always use when you're setting up your style sheet. And it needs to be the very first thing that you place in your style sheet. The reason for that is, again, precedence. Remember the rule, the closer a definition, as closer a style is to the element that it's formatting, the more precedence that it has. Well, looking right here, you can see I've got H1 and I've got a number of different elements here. Now, let's say that I came up here and had some styles before my reset. And let's say I said H1, the font color should be red. Just like that. Well, down here, it says the font color should be black. I'll save that. When we look at our test, there's our CSS reset, and you can see my H1s are not black, are not red, they're black. And that's because this is farther away than this definition is here. So your reset always needs to be the very first thing inside of your style sheet in order for it to work correctly and for all of your other styles to work as well. So make sure that you use a CSS reset, whether it's the one that comes in my framework or one that you find out there on the internet. Now, just a couple more things that I want to talk about in this video. I've deleted that reset and we're back to just seeing our normal HTML page here. So far, when we've defined a style, we've just gone ahead and said H1 and then we've defined the style. And then we've done H2 and defined the style for that. And if we had H3s, we might define the style for that one as well. So here I've got three different styles for three different heading levels, and they have the exact same value. Instead of writing my styles like this, what I could do is I could create a grouped selector. And you do that by doing H1, H2, H3. And you may have seen this when we did the CSS reset. The CSS reset is basically a collection of group selectors that zeroes things out. And I could do color, just like that. This here does exactly the same thing as this. You use a group selector like this when you want to always make sure that a grouping of elements has the exact same value. So if in your design you always want to make sure that all of your headings are in the same color, you could use a group selector. If it just so happens that all of your headings are the same color, but you didn't do that by design and it may change later, well, then it's best to have them individually like this right here. So it all depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to make sure a series of elements have the same value, use a group selector. If not, do them individually. Now, just because you have a group selector does not mean that you can't also have individual selectors. Here I'm using a group selector to define the color, but I could just as easily after that or before it come along and specify the font size as being different for each one of these. So I could do H1, font size is going to be 30 pixels. H2, it's going to be 24 pixels. And H3 is going to be 18 pixels. So here I'm using a group selector because I want to make sure that all of my headings are always the same color. But I'm using individual selectors or individual styles for the font size because I want to make sure that I want to define those properties differently. And I could have another property in here. Let's say I wanted to make sure that the font was always the same. Well, I could define the font family there. And if I wanted to always make sure that my headings were bold, I could define that there. If I want to make sure that just my H3s are italicized, well, I wouldn't put that up here because that would affect H1s and H2s, but I could put it down here. So I could do font style here and italicize my H3s. So group selectors are a powerful way to specifically target elements and define their properties. Not only does it make your code more compact, it also helps you enforce consistency when you want that consistency. Now, the second kind of selector that I want to talk about, we've talked about using individual selectors, and we've talked about doing group selectors. I want to talk about descendant selectors. Descendant selectors. And you're going to be using descendant selectors all the time in your designs. And what descendant selectors allow you to do is style an element based on its parent-child relationship. Now, I just said parent-child relationship. What do I mean by that? When I go ahead and look at the code for this, you're going to see that I have all of these elements here, and they're inside of this div section 2. I have all of these elements here, and they're all in a div called section 1. So I've got paragraphs in section 1, and I've also got paragraphs in section 2. Well, what if I want my paragraphs in section 1, and actually I'm going to go ahead and remove these styles here. So we're back to just our plain test sheet. What if I want my paragraphs in section 1 to be formatted differently than my paragraphs in section 2? Or to sort of give you a practical example of this, what if I wanted my paragraphs in my sidebar to be formatted differently than my paragraphs in my content area? Or what if I want my list items in the social media div to be formatted differently than my list items in my top nav? Well, the answer is you can use a descendant selector for that. I can say find all of the paragraphs in section 1 and format them in this manner. And I do that by by laying out the parent-child relationship. In this case, I want to target section 1 and the p tags. So in my style sheet, I could do section 1 space p, and then I could do color and make them red. So I've said find section, or find the element with the ID section 1, and any time you find a paragraph in section 1, format it with this color. And we go ahead and look at our code. You can see there's a red paragraph and there's a red paragraph. But when I come down here in section 2, that's not targeted. So a descendant selector allows you to define a style based on its parent-child relationship. And one very common use for that is defining elements, or defining the way elements should be formatted based on what div they're inside of. In this case, P's in the section 1 div. Let's take a look at another example of that. I'm going to come in here to code view, and you can see I've got a couple of lists here. I've got an unordered list with list items, and then I have an ordered list with list items. And I have another unordered list actually in section 2. Now, if I was to come here in my style sheet and just say li color red, what that's going to do is it's going to format all of my list items. Doesn't matter whether they're in ULs or OLs or what div they're inside of or anything else. All of my list items are going to be formatted that way. And sure enough, those are all in red, and these are in red as well. But again, we can use the concept of the descendant selector to be more specific. What if I just wanted to format list items that were part of ordered lists? I wanted to leave ULs alone. Just list items that are inside of OLs. Well, I could come here to my CSS style sheet and I could say OL space LI. Find any OLs, and when you find list items inside of an OL, make them this color. And now when I go ahead and look at this, you can see the unordered lists have been left alone, but the ordered lists are now in red. I could change that to UL, and now my ULs, regardless of what div they're inside of, are formatted that way with the red color, but my OLs have been left alone. And again, this may seem a little bit cryptic at this point, or you may not see the exact utility of this, but when we start actually laying out our page, you're going to see that almost every one of your styles is going to be a descendant selector. What if I wanted to just target list items that are in unordered lists that are in section 1? Well, in that case, I have section 1 UL LI. That's the parent-child relationship here. So I could do section 1 UL LI. Find any list items that are contained in unordered lists that are in section 1. And now when I look at it, you can see this unordered list is formatted in red, but this one has been left alone, as well as my ordered list right there. So descendant selectors allow you to very specifically target something based on, again, its parent-child relationship. And the one thing that you should take away from this specific part of the lesson is the concept of the parent-child relationship in your HTML. In this case, body is the parent of everything on the page. Div is the parent of everything in that division. UL is the parent of everything inside of it. So the parent-child relationship is important to understand when you're learning how to create CSS styles. And again, as we go through our project website, you're going to see, and write the CSS for that, you're going to see where that's a very, very essential skill, understanding how to define that parent-child relationship. And there are variations of different ways to do this, but this is a basic, simple descendant selector, and what you're going to need, all that you're going to need to create the layout for this particular page. So that's all I wanted to cover in this video. So we're going to go ahead and take a break. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and finish up our introduction to CSS. And specifically in that video, we're going to talk about something called the CSS box model. The CSS box model. And we're going to also talk about CSS positioning in that video. So far, most of what we've talked about has to do with formatting elements, not actually positioning elements on the page or determining their size. And that's what we're going to go ahead and do in the next video. So I'll see you then.